So we're going to the main thing we kind of wanted to talk about today was they made a big announcement a couple weeks ago. Or actually, funny enough, they actually did not make an announcement, uh, which is we are pretty sure from all signs that this is the last patch of the last major raid of this expansion with the announcement of the permanent augment rune. This is not confirmed. It's all of this could be. It's very heavily assumed. You could look at a few things in the past. They always do the augment rune in the last raid. They always do like the AOTC mount thing, and those all lined up. But now that both of them are there, it's kind of like this is what they're doing. So I guess what was your all's initial reaction to that when you read that and assuming that is the case?
Yeah,
So
go ahead, Dorky. Yeah.
okay, I was gonna say real quick. So I had a lot to think about with this. I mean, I think the only way this is possibly great for us is if we have a shorter expansion, or if we somehow have a banger faded. But yeah, you can continue, Trails.
Yeah, I mean, so the evidence, right, is it is the augment rune, which 3 out of 3 times has been on the last patch. I will say though, a permanent augment rune would be better if it wasn't on the last patch, right? Like it would actually be a more useful
Correct.
game piece if we could actually get access to it on the second to last patch.
Ooh.
So that would be, and this one costs twice as much as the old ones did as well. So perhaps that means it's going to be active for twice as many patches. You know, there's still, I will say, like I wouldn't treat it as a done deal just yet. That we're going to get this as the final patch of the expansion. The AOTC mount is another piece of evidence, although they've done AOTC mounts for non-end bosses, I think, of expansions before, but maybe that's fake news. Either way, though, I do think it is probably likely that this will be the last major patch / raid of the expansion, which, like, from those pieces of evidence, that definitely does make it the most likely thing. And yeah, my initial reaction was, why, right? Like, why is this expansion that's been kind of motoring along so quickly? Why we're like less than a year into the expansion as of right now, right? And why are we already about to have the last raid of the expansion? Like, are we settling in for another Hellfire Citadel or Siege of Orgrimmar length farm, or are we slamming an early 11.0, or what's going on here, right? Like, how it just seemed so out of place given how quick Aberrus followed on the heels of Vault Incarnates.
Yeah, and we can show a we can show a graph. We have like some information here to show like the patch cadence. We'll get into that in a second. Yeah, well, look at that production quality right up on the screen. Frank, let's go.
All right, Frank, we're back on the scoreboard here. Good work.
Yeah. Just to kind of give you an idea of like what you would expect out of a major expansion, right? So you see that outside of BFA, so like BFA's old year into BOD was faster than Vault into Aberrus, but then the dates, the projected dates, I think maybe I don't know if the Dragonflight 196 is from the official release date of November 7th, but obviously the thing you can compare it to the most outside of the most recent COVID expansion is BFA, right? But BFA had 4 major raids, and also BFA had much less content being produced within every patch as well, right? So I guess why the initial feeling, at least for me, is pretty negative, assuming that we're keeping the whole 2-year expansion cycle, is it just kind of feels like there's going to be way too much dead space. And in the expansion where you've been churning out content, it would seem like 6 months from now, and it's like, okay, in a couple months we'll get faded, but we've just been in Amir Drasil for 8 months or whatever. I mean, that's gonna feel horrible. No shame on faded. We'll talk about faded in a bit. Faded's great. But I'm heavily hoping what Dratnos is saying is true. And good news is we won't have to speculate for very long, because what they did at the end of last year was, for the first time ever, they produced this roadmap for everything that was being released by WoW, and they've stuck to that for the last year. We assume at BlizzCon in November, right, 1 month before the previous year, you will get one of those for the next year. And if there's a major patch in there, I'm sure we'll see it. So hoping for the best.
Yeah, I think that the other sort of good case would be if this wasn't a 2-year expansion, right? Like if the next expansion is in May or something, then I think I'm also reasonably happy with the pace of content. That would mean that Dragonflight would be like a 1.5-year expansion. And the sort of cynical take there would be, okay, now Blizzard's found a way to do the expansions faster, sell an extra, 2 expansions every decade or something and make extra money off of us that
Smart
way.
one.
Right, which does, work, right? Like that does get them extra money. But I don't know. I mean, if they're good expansions and good raids,
I'd be
I'd
okay
be
with
fine
that.
with
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I wouldn't really care too much about that. Price of the sub really hasn't moved in a long time. I'd be fine with paying a little bit extra for an extra expansion if the quality and pace of content was good. But what I really would be sad to see would be if this goes on to like the length of that Shadowlands bar and we just have like a big faded season starting in April or something. Like that would be I'd be
That would
pretty sad
be
about that.
horrific. Yeah. Like the only thing that makes this make sense is a nice expansion in the middle of the summer, and there's whatever reason going into this expansion, they were like, all right, we are moving this up. And this is the plan they had all along. They're not behind, they're not dropping a raid. That's just what they're doing, right? And Faded will help break that up. I actually kind of want to talk a little bit about that. I've noticed there's so many community sentiments about Faded, and I think I understand them. And tell me if you guys think there's another angle that's coming from this. Most negativity I understand from Faded is from a misunderstanding of what Faded is. Because I think all of us would agree that a Faded season replacing what would have been a real a real season, right? Like its own Mythic Plus season, raid, all that stuff. If you are getting that instead of the other thing, Faded seems bad by comparison. But that's never what Faded was, right? Faded was not something on Blizzard's development plan at the beginning of Shadowlands. It was something at the end of season 3, so the Sepulchre raid, that was made by a few developers. So like normally 100+ developers what make a regular WoW season. This was developed kind of improvised by a couple of developers to make the end of expansion less like you're just doing Sepulchre for a year, right? And it broke it up. It allowed for It allowed for experimenting. Like you had, it's probably a big reason why the upgrade system is the way it is now, which is a widely liked thing in the game, right? They got to experiment with that on Heroic. They got to see what that looked like on like a lesser scale. It showed us dinars, right? Something you can see going forward, that, loot targeting. We actually got to use loot targeting, and people are like, okay, we really, really want this. And it's not like some made up thing where you're like, this would maybe be good. Like, no, we've used it. It's definitely good. And you got to see that from this small mini season, right? So basically, if you're arguing against Faded, the argument is, unless Blizzard starts using it to replace seasons, which would be bad, the argument against it is, we'd rather not do that experimenting. And instead of having this fun end of expansion thing, it's just a much longer Sepulchre season, which is a crazy argument to me. Do you know if it's any more nuanced than that?
Okay, so I do think there is a little bit more to that because I do feel like there are some players who probably would rather stay in the current season so that they can continue with whatever they have rather than having to reprogress everything all over again. I mean, maybe not necessarily reprogressing, but at the very least, rebuilding up your character. Since going into it, Faded Season basically meant your gear resets and you couldn't continue with where you were before. And especially for like some of the lower end guilds. Well, I guess Sepulchre was kind of an anomaly since there were players that were probably stuck progging Sepulchre still at the very end of season 3. And going
Yeah.
into season 4 basically meant like, oh, well, me, like goodbye to everything that you've been doing. So I could definitely see some sentiments there, but this feels more like a raider kind of thing. Because like from what I've heard from M plusers at least, majority of M plusers were pretty happy with Faded. I mean, Faded basically meant another season of M plus, like new dungeons, dinar system, ways of experimenting, and fun seasonal affix. Which I'm not sure what they're gonna do about this Faded if they do happen to have one. But if they somehow like brought back a banger seasonal, they brought back people's favorite dungeons, and they just like try to add something fun to the game, it's definitely a positive for M plusers for the most part.
Yeah, I
So
do think most of it comes from that, and from I think there's a little bit of people that I would summarize them as people that the gearing up process versus the doing new content, like gearing up is a price you pay to do the new content, and they don't enjoy the gearing up. So if you just have a patch that's gearing up and no new content, they might not like that. But I think it's mostly negative sentiment around Faded is they don't want to give Blizzard cover for doing a Shadowlands, right? With 3 major patches that last longer than Legion with 4. And they there's kind of this vibe that if you're positive about Faded, you're maybe giving Blizzard the green light to do that in the future, which none of us that liked the Faded experiment are actually saying that, right? But like that's,
of course.
I think, the vibe.
No, I mean that totally makes sense. I think all of us would agree that if Faded became this thing, we're like, oh, people like Faded, and it was like very little time for us to do this thing that gave people a lot of extra content. So now we can save more money by not developing an extra season, and we can just do this thing. Everyone, what's the meme? Like everyone disliked that. Like no one would like that, but that's not what Faded has ever been. I think that if Faded, very simply, whatever the last raid tier is, assuming Faded doesn't exist, like it didn't at the beginning of Shadowlands planning, or even halfway through that expansion, if it is something that just supplements the last season, I think the raid affixes were super whatever. They could either do away with that or completely redo it or remove them. I think it would have been mostly the same. But I think it's great. I do understand the like casual guilds still progressing thing. At that point, Jailer been out for a while is also the most heavily nerfed boss ever. I understand Anduin killed a lot of guilds, but even if you were a guild that was like still trying to clear, once Faded came out, couldn't you still go back into Sepulcher? There was just new gear available and stuff, right? So like you could still go do that. You could still, I don't know if you could still farm the mount. Maybe you could.
I think
but
CE was gone. I think you could still do
cutting
mount
edge
runs,
maybe.
though, yeah. And
but the cutting edge wasn't
2 out of every
short.
3 weeks whenever Sepulcher wasn't Faded until they made all 3 of them Faded at the very end.
Yeah, so I guess you couldn't get cutting edge, but was that a really short cutting edge tier? I wonder on this graph, it shows, people are wondering what this graph is. It's showing you the duration of major patches throughout all of the WoW expansions. That's not really labeled, but yeah.
That's Frog's fault. He's already admitted fault in the Discord about that as well.
Yeah. So I guess that's actually a good point. Like if you look at Shadowlands, for example, the timing of Faded, you have, right, it's like 200 days for the first patch, 200 days to get cutting edge in the second patch, which is already much longer than normal expansions. And then the Sepulcher one was actually much shorter because of Faded. So I guess you could make an argument to have Faded start a little bit later. But I would say that the people waiting to finish cutting edge is a far more niche, small audience than the amount of people that gain something new, right? The other thing that's kind of weird too that I know really a lot of guilds struggled with is when Faded came out, every week you were progressing a new raid and you had really low eye level right away, so it was pretty difficult. Think about 3-day guilds, right? A 3-day guild raids on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Monday. I'm pretty sure everyone in here that's raided in one of those guilds will know the feeling of logging on a Wednesday after just yesterday you were on this boss, and you're going to be much better at it. And then the difference between logging on Monday after it's been 5 days since your last raid, and you spend at least half of that raid day remembering what you did the last time because it's just been so long, and that like halts your progression majorly. So the thing with Faded that I found really interesting is guilds were basically forced to do that every week. If you were doing any realistic progression in Faded whatsoever, which was like the only content to challenge yourself in raid, you were like learning 3 different raids at the same time, kind of, you know, if you hadn't been like fully raiding the whole expansion, and they were all like pretty challenging. So like it was really hard to actually make realistic progression. And I think some guilds would have maybe preferred to stick to one of them and work on it over a few weeks.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Faded M Plus experiment was wildly successful, and the Faded raid experiment was a mixed bag. And maybe they should try a different experiment with what raid should do, like the affixes and the cycle of the raids. Maybe next time, if we do another Faded season, those should be re-examined. And maybe instead of cycling through all the Dragonflight raids, maybe the Faded season is just Nighthold for a month, and then you know, Blackrock Foundry for a month, and then
I want to play MOP. That's what. Yeah, I mean, apparently people were like hyped about MOP, and I never got to try MOP. That'd be cool to kind of like go through the MOP raids.
Oh yeah, that would be Siege of Orgrimmar and Throne of Thunder would transfer really well to modern raid mechanics. A lot of those fights tuned at you know, the hardest difficulty would be very challenging, and it would solve the problem of, you know, bouncing between raids every week kind of thing. Or I mean, an easy solution to that too is having them all available from the beginning, and your group that's not clearing them all in 1 week or whatever, because that's like a super high end problem. Oh man, we have to clear all the raids on Mythic this week, you know, like I mean, so you can just choose to not do that. The other guilds can like choose which raid they want to progress first, right? Rather than something like that. So there's a lot of ways to make it better.